The news anchor's voice carried the kind of calm that only amplifies disaster. Shares of Hale Motors fell another 32% this morning after federal regulators confirmed a nationwide recall of over 2 million vehicles. Reports indicate catastrophic engine failures linked to a core cylinder design flaw. Behind her, graphics flashed in red. Market lines plunged. Video clips looped of stalled sedans on highways, smoke rising from open hoods, frustrated drivers standing on the shoulder with hazard lights blinking. Another correspondent appeared in a split screen outside Hale Motors' glass headquarters. Sources inside the company claim engineers raised concerns about the defect years ago, he said. Those warnings were allegedly dismissed during aggressive expansion campaigns under CEO Victoria Hale. The footage cut to Victoria herself, stepping briskly past reporters, jaw set, eyes forward, refusing questions. "Ms. Hale, were you aware of internal warnings? Did you ignore defect reports? Who knew?" She did not answer. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Internal warnings ignored."
Hundreds of miles away, in a small town where the highway narrowed to 2 lanes and the billboards advertised tractor parts instead of stock portfolios, a portable radio sat on a dusty workbench beneath a flickering fluorescent light. Federal investigators are now requesting maintenance records from independent service shops that handled early prototype engines, the announcer continued. Legal analysts predict significant liability exposure. A wrench clinked softly against concrete. Daniel Mercer stood over an open engine block, hands dark with oil, movements steady and unhurried. The garage smelled of metal and gasoline, old rubber and motor grease, the honest scent of mechanical truth. He reached over and turned the radio off with 2 fingers. Silence settled in. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past. Somewhere in the back of the shop, an air compressor hissed and released. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and looked at the row of disassembled engines along the far wall. Some had tags attached, some did not. The filing cabinet near his office door stood closed, metal drawer labeled in neat black marker. Warranty returns.
He didn't shake his head, didn't sigh. He just picked up his wrench again. He wasn't surprised. Cut. Daniel Mercer was 39 years old and built like the engines he repaired. Solid, worn in the right places, dependable under pressure. Mercer Auto Repair sat on the edge of town, between a grain supply store and an abandoned car wash whose sign hadn't worked in years. The shop wasn't polished, but it was clean in the way working spaces are clean when the work matters. Tools hung in careful order along pegboard walls, oil pans stacked neatly beneath lifts, invoices clipped with deliberate precision. Daniel had owned the garage since he was 26, taking over from his father just before cancer took the older man. 5 years later, he buried his wife after a sudden illness and learned how to balance torque specifications with bedtime stories. Mornings began before sunrise. Coffee at 4:45. Shop lights on by 5:15. By 6:30, 8-year-old Noah would wander in wearing oversized headphones, carrying a plastic container of cereal, and sit cross-legged near the workbench. He treated dismantled carburetors like puzzles, lining up bolts by size, asking questions most adults wouldn't think to ask.
"Why would they make it thinner there?" he once asked, pointing to a cracked cylinder wall. Daniel had paused longer than necessary before answering. "Sometimes people design for speed," he said, "not for endurance." Against the back wall of the office stood a gray metal filing cabinet, dented near the base, but locked every night without fail. A strip of black tape labeled it in block letters, "Warranty Returns." Daniel never explained the drawer to customers, and he never left it open. Inside were dated photographs, repair summaries, serial numbers, correspondence, records of engines that had arrived with the same internal failure, despite different vehicles, different dealerships, different states. The garage's single window looked out toward the highway, where transport trucks passed daily, some carrying brand new cars toward cities with glass towers and stock tickers. Those towers belonged to companies like Hale Motors,
where polished executives discussed growth percentages beneath recessed lighting. Daniel's world was different.
His was measured in compression ratios, in careful torque settings, in listening to an engine idle and knowing whether it would last another 1,000 miles or another 100,000. He didn't advertise aggressively. Word of mouth kept him busy enough. He charged fairly, worked steadily, and never rushed a repair because someone else's schedule demanded it. Noah grew up learning the language of metal fatigue and gasket failure instead of corporate branding. And 10 years earlier, on a morning much like this one, a flatbed truck from Hale Motors had pulled into his gravel lot for the first time. 10 years earlier, Hale Motors had been the kind of company business magazines described as unstoppable. Victoria Hale arrived in town in a black sedan that seemed too polished for the gravel lot it rolled into, stepping out in tailored heels that didn't belong anywhere near an oil stain. She was in the middle of a nationwide expansion campaign, opening new dealerships in rural markets and courting headlines about innovation and growth. The visit to Mercer Auto Repair was framed as partnership outreach, supporting local diagnostics, her assistant had called it. The first flatbed carried 3 prototype engines tagged for independent evaluation. The paperwork described minor irregularities reported by early drivers, nothing systemic. Daniel had nodded and signed the intake form, but he didn't believe paperwork until he saw metal. Within hours of disassembly, he found scoring along the cylinder walls that didn't match normal wear, stress fractures forming at the same thin point near the combustion chamber in all 3 units. It wasn't coincidence, it was design. When Victoria toured the shop later that afternoon, stepping carefully between lifts, Daniel laid out the components on a clean table and explained what he was seeing. "These aren't minor defects," he said plainly. "The cylinder wall thickness here can't handle sustained heat. It'll crack under pressure." She listened without interrupting, arms folded lightly, expression composed but distant. "We're refining manufacturing tolerances," she replied. "Early runs always have imperfections." Daniel shook his head once. "This isn't tolerance, it's geometry." The words seemed to irritate her more than the accusation. "Our engineers disagree," she said, glancing toward her assistant. "You're an independent shop. Your role here is diagnostic, not developmental." He held her gaze. "If this design scales, you'll see widespread failures." She didn't argue further. She simply straightened her jacket and said, "Just fix what you can." The phrase settled heavier than she intended. The engines were left behind, along with a modest contract labeling the work as confidential diagnostics. Daniel repaired what was salvageable, reinforced where he could, and documented everything he touched.
He recorded serial numbers. He logged repeated failure points in a notebook he later transferred into the filing cabinet labeled Warranty Returns. When the next shipment arrived 3 months later, same model, same fractures, he wasn't surprised. Victoria didn't visit every time after that. Eventually, trucks dropped engines without ceremony, and emails from Hale Motors' internal teams shifted tone from inquiry to instruction. Isolate anomaly. Replace affected units. Do not attribute failure to design. Daniel never argued in writing. He never threatened exposure. He simply kept records. And over the years, as Hale Motors' profits climbed and Victoria appeared on magazine covers celebrating innovation, the engines kept coming. One by one. Same flaw, same thin wall, same quiet warning embedded in metal. Years passed. The trucks never arrived at the same time of day, but they always arrived. Sometimes before sunrise, sometimes just before closing. Always carrying engines wrapped in branded tarps and paperwork that described the problem in careful, minimizing language. Isolated overheating event. Customer misuse suspected. Preliminary stress irregularity. The phrasing changed. The fracture did not. Daniel developed a rhythm to it. Intake form, photograph the exterior, remove casing, inspect cylinder wall, measure thickness, compare to prior logs. The weakness always lived in the same place.
An elegant, cost-saving decision, shaved thin enough to look efficient, but not durable. Under ordinary driving, it survived. Under sustained load, it cracked. He began indexing them by year. Drawer 1, 2013-2014. Drawer 2, 2015-2016. By 2018, the gray filing cabinet had required a second interior divider because the volume of documentation no longer fit neatly in a single row. Each engine received a folder. Each folder contained photographs, repair summaries, serial numbers, and correspondence threads printed and annotated. Daniel didn't dramatize the pattern. He mapped it. Emails from Hale Motors' internal engineering team followed predictable arcs. At first, they were polite. Appreciate your diagnostic support. Then guarded. Please refrain from speculative conclusions regarding design intent. Later, firmer. Repairs should address isolated anomalies only. The subtext was always clear. Fix the symptom, not the cause. Daniel never replied with accusation. He sent back measurements, torque specs, heat distribution data. If they dismissed it, the dismissal joined the folder. Noah grew up watching engines disassembled like mechanical autopsies.
Why? Cheaper, Daniel answered once, then softened the explanation. Faster to make. Is it wrong? Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and considered the question longer than the technical answer required. It depends, he said finally, on whether you knew it would fail. As the years passed, Hale Motors' public image only grew stronger. Victoria Hale appeared on conference panels speaking about innovation, sustainability, efficiency. Quarterly earnings climbed. Expansion accelerated. News segments praised her for modernizing domestic manufacturing. In Daniel's shop, another engine block split cleanly along the same fragile seam. He could have sued. He could have contacted regulators anonymously. He could have spoken to journalists looking for angles. Instead, he documented. Not out of fear, not out of loyalty, out of patience. The filing cabinet labeled warranty returns became less a storage solution and more an archive. He installed a small digital scanner in his office and backed up every document to an encrypted drive stored separately. Photos were time-stamped, measurements cross-referenced, emails preserved in chronological order. The pattern wasn't anecdotal anymore. It was statistical.
Sometimes, late at night, after Noah was asleep, Daniel would sit at his desk and review the accumulated data. He would overlay engine serial numbers against production dates and notice how defect frequency spiked after certain expansion quarters. He would track repair costs borne by customers before warranty windows closed. The story assembled itself slowly, without noise. Noah once found him staring at a stack of folders and asked, "Why keep all of that?" Daniel closed the door gently. "Because truth doesn't need to shout," he said. "It just needs to be there when someone's ready to listen." The garage remained small. The sign outside faded in the sun. He never upgraded to a larger facility, never pursued dealership contracts that might have doubled revenue. He repaired what came through the door and sent invoices without embellishment. The engines from Hale Motors kept arriving, each one carrying the same structural compromise disguised as variance. By year 8, independent customer complaints began appearing online. Forums filled with stories of engines seizing under heavy load. Dealership responses echoed the internal emails Daniel had read for years. Isolated incidents, driver error, maintenance oversight. He watched without comment. By year 9, a regional news station ran a short segment about unexpected failures in rural fleets. Victoria Hale dismissed it as supplier inconsistency. Stock prices dipped for 2 days and recovered by the end of the week. Daniel added another folder to the drawer. The pattern was no longer quiet. It was waiting. And eventually, the cracks in metal would become cracks in narrative. When Victoria Hale returned to town nearly a decade after that first delivery,
It wasn't to stand in an oil-stained garage, but to cut a ribbon in front of a gleaming new dealership built 3 blocks from Mercer Auto Repair. The event was staged for cameras, balloons in corporate colors, a polished showroom floor reflecting overhead lights, a banner reading, "Innovation Driven Forward." Daniel hadn't planned to attend, but Noah insisted on seeing the new models up close. They stood at the edge of the crowd, while Victoria spoke confidently about growth, reliability, and commitment to American engineering. After the speech, as she toured the property with local officials, her gaze drifted toward the older buildings across the street. He looked up at his father, confusion tightening into embarrassment. Daniel felt the shift, but did not react. He simply placed a hand on his son's shoulder and kept his eyes steady. He did not argue across the street. He did not remind her of the engines that had passed through his shop for years. He did not mention the filing cabinet. He let the laughter dissolve on its own. Victoria turned back toward the cameras, unaware that her remark would linger longer than she intended. That afternoon, as they returned to the garage, Noah asked, "Is that what you are? Just a local mechanic?" Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and met his son's eyes. "I fix what people bring me," he said evenly. He did not add more. Across the highway, a transport truck roared past, carrying another shipment of brand-new Hale Motors vehicles toward cities that believed the promise printed in glossy brochures. And somewhere, hundreds of miles away, the first reports of a catastrophic engine seizure began circulating quietly through a service network no one outside the industry was paying attention to yet.
The first official recall came quietly, framed as precautionary. A limited batch of vehicles produced during a specific quarter had experienced unexpected engine stress irregularities. Victoria Hale appeared on financial news panels reassuring investors that the issue was isolated and under control. 2 weeks later, the second recall followed, this time larger, affecting vehicles sold in 3 states. Drivers reported engines stalling without warning at highway speeds, dashboards flashing before going dark, smoke rising from hoods as metal seized against metal. Online forums filled with videos of stranded families and commercial fleet operators counting losses by the day. Then the third recall hit, nationwide, and the language shifted from irregularities to defects. A whistleblower released internal memos to a journalist, emails from mid-level engineers warning about structural thinning in the core cylinder walls, urging design revisions years earlier. The memos were time-stamped during the same expansion period when Hale Motors' production output had surged. Victoria went on record again, this time attributing the failures to a component supplier whose materials did not meet contracted standards.
Within hours, the supplier issued a public denial, producing independent metallurgical tests proving their alloy integrity. Analysts began dissecting engine diagrams on live television, pointing to stress fractures forming along identical weak points. Market confidence evaporated. Hale Motors stock plummeted in consecutive trading sessions. Billions wiped from valuation in less than a week. Regulatory agencies announced investigations. Plaintiffs' attorneys advertised on late-night television, inviting affected owners to join class-action lawsuits. In his small garage, Daniel listened to the broadcast reports between the clatter of tools and the hiss of compressed air. He did not interrupt his work. When a customer asked if the news surprised him, he shook his head once and said only, "Metal doesn't lie." That evening, after Noah had gone inside to finish homework, Daniel walked into his office and unlocked the gray filing cabinet. Drawer after drawer slid open smoothly, revealing 10 years of documentation. Photographs of cracked cylinder walls, measurement charts highlighting identical thinning points, serial numbers cross-referenced to production runs, printed emails cautioning against speculative conclusions.
The folders were thick, organized chronologically, each one a quiet testimony to what he had seen long before the headlines caught up. He spread several across the desk, lining up early prototypes beside recent failures, the pattern unmistakable, even without commentary. The flaw had never moved, only the narrative around it had. On television,
Commentators debated whether executives could plausibly claim ignorance. In Daniel's office, the evidence answered that question without drama. He had flagged the weakness in year 1. He had photographed it in year 3. He had logged repeated occurrences in year 6. The geometry never changed. Profit margins had. Victoria's image shifted from visionary innovator to embattled executive in less than a month. Press conferences grew shorter, statements more guarded. Independent engineers interviewed on air traced the collapse back to design shortcuts masked as efficiency improvements. Daniel closed one folder and opened another, scanning the earliest intake form from a decade prior, his own handwriting noting insufficient wall thickness under sustained heat. He exhaled slowly, not in satisfaction, but in recognition.
The collapse unfolding across news channels was not sudden, it was cumulative. It was the predictable result of ignored warnings layered year upon year until metal fatigue became corporate fracture. Outside, the town continued its routines. Traffic lights changing, grocery stores closing at 9, kids riding bicycles past the garage, unaware that the company dominating headlines had once treated this shop as a quiet dumping ground. Daniel locked the filing cabinet again, leaving one folder on the desk. The radio shifted to a segment about federal subpoenas issued to Hale Motors' executive team. He reached over and turned the volume down. He had never intended to become part of a national story. He had simply kept records. 2 days later, the federal investigators arrived without sirens or spectacle. 2 unmarked sedans parking quietly outside Mercer Auto Repair just after opening hours. They stepped out in plain suits, folders in hand, expressions neutral but alert. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and walked out to meet them before they could knock. They introduced themselves from the Department of Transportation's Compliance Division, accompanied by a forensic engineering analyst assigned to the Hale Motors investigation.
"We understand you've serviced a significant number of recalled engines," one of them said. Daniel nodded once and led them inside, past the lifts and tool racks, into the small office where the gray filing cabinet stood. He didn't posture or recount grievances. He simply unlocked the drawer and began setting folders on the desk. Photographs of cracked cylinder walls, neatly dated. Measurement charts highlighting identical stress points across multiple model years. Email printouts from Hale Motors' internal engineering team advising him to avoid speculative attribution. The investigators leaned in, flipping pages carefully, eyes scanning timestamps. "You documented this in 2013?" one asked. Daniel slid forward the earliest folder. "First intake from their prototype batch," he said. "Same geometry flaw." The forensic analyst compared the photos against official recall diagrams displayed. "They were informed," one investigator murmured, tracing the email chain back 9 years. The power in the room shifted not through confrontation, but through clarity. Daniel had not speculated, he had measured. He had not accused, he had archived. The investigators requested digital copies, and Daniel handed over an encrypted drive containing scanned backups, cross-referenced, and organized chronologically. "Why didn't you go public?" the analyst asked. Daniel met his gaze evenly. "I fix engines," he said. "I document patterns." Outside, a local news van slowed near the curb, unaware of what was unfolding inside. By the time the investigators finished cataloging the evidence, the narrative of the collapse had changed direction. This was no longer a sudden supplier malfunction. It was a decade-long design flaw, flagged and ignored. One investigator closed the final folder and said quietly, "You warned them." Daniel nodded once. He did not smile. He did not express vindication. The reversal was already happening beyond his garage walls, in regulatory briefings and legal filings, where Victoria Hale's prior assurances would now be weighed against documented warnings she had dismissed. As the sedans pulled away, Daniel stood in the doorway of his shop, watching the dust settle on the gravel lot. That afternoon, a black SUV rolled slowly toward the garage, and when it stopped, Victoria Hale stepped out alone. Victoria Hale stepped into the garage without cameras this time. No polished entourage, no ribbon-cutting applause, just the faint scent of oil and metal hanging in the air. She removed her sunglasses slowly, as if shedding the last layer of public armor before facing the man she once dismissed. "I need your cooperation," she began, voice composed but thinner than it had been years earlier. She spoke of context, of misunderstanding, of design evolution. She implied that testimony could be shaped carefully, framed responsibly, that unnecessary damage to the company and to employees who depended on it could be avoided with discretion. She didn't offer money outright at first. She offered language. "There are ways to clarify this without assigning intent," she said. When that didn't move him, the implication shifted. Consulting contracts, compensation, future alignment. Daniel listened without interruption, hands resting lightly on the workbench behind him. He did not appear angry. He did not raise old grievances. When she finally stopped, he said quietly, "You're asking me to soften the truth." Victoria held his gaze, but did not deny it. The garage was silent, except for the ticking of cooling metal. Daniel picked up a cracked cylinder wall from the bench and set it gently back down. "I fix engines," he said evenly. "I don't fix lies."
The sentence landed without hostility. It wasn't a moral performance. It was a boundary. He explained that he would testify exactly to what he measured, exactly to what he documented, nothing more and nothing less. He would not embellish. He would not speculate. He would not accept payment for silence. Victoria's shoulders tightened slightly, then settled. For the first time in the conversation, she nodded. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of finality. Daniel walked her to the garage door without ceremony. There was no satisfaction in his expression, only steadiness. Outside, the world was already shifting toward hearings and subpoenas. Inside, the truth remained where it had always been. Written, dated, waiting. The next time they would face each other would not be in a garage, but under oath. The hearing room was colder than Daniel expected, fluorescent lights reflecting off polished wood and the low murmur of reporters arranging their recorders along the back wall. Victoria Hale sat at the center of the executive table, expression carefully composed, legal counsel flanking her on both sides. Cameras. He explained cylinder wall thickness in plain terms, comparing engineering tolerances to everyday stress, how repeated heat cycles under sustained load would inevitably fracture material designed too thin. He referenced production dates, serial numbers, email exchanges. He avoided adjectives. He avoided accusation. "I measured recurring structural fatigue beginning in 2013, he said. The pattern did not vary across model years. A committee member leaned forward. Were these concerns communicated to Hale Motors? Daniel turned a page and read from an email timestamped 9 years earlier, his own words precise, Victoria's reply brief and dismissive. The room shifted subtly. Even the board members seemed to absorb the weight of it. Victoria did not interrupt. She stared straight ahead, jaw set, as if acknowledging that argument would only amplify the record. Daniel concluded not with condemnation, but with geometry. Metal doesn't adapt to narrative, he said quietly. It responds to stress. A reporter scribbled that line immediately. By the time the session adjourned, the narrative outside the chamber had shifted from supplier fault to documented oversight. Commentators on evening broadcasts referred to him not as local mechanic, but as independent diagnostic specialist who raised early warnings.
The working-class garage owner became the credible authority in a national conversation about corporate responsibility. He did not linger for interviews. He left the building the same way he entered, without spectacle. Outside, cameras pivoted toward Victoria as she stepped past them, her silence more telling than any prepared statement. By sunset, financial analysts were discussing restructuring scenarios rather than denial strategies. Daniel drove home through traffic that flowed as if nothing historic had happened. knowing that what changed in that room would ripple outward long after the headlines cooled. In the days that followed, Hale Motors announced executive resignations and formal restructuring, while Mercer Auto Repair opened its bay doors at sunrise as it always had, engines still arriving, not from corporate contracts now, but from customers who trusted steady hands more than polished promises. By the time the garage lights dimmed and the last customer drove off, the town had already begun to move on from the hearings that dominated national news feeds. Daniel locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed, the metal clink echoing softly in the quiet shop. Noah emerged from the back room, carrying a socket wrench almost too large for his hands, eyes bright with questions he had been holding all day. "Did you win?" he asked, standing near the workbench where a partially dismantled engine waited under steady fluorescent light. Daniel considered the question, wiping grease from his fingers before answering.
"I told the truth," he said simply. Noah nodded, as if weighing that response against something bigger than victory. Together, they returned to the engine block, Daniel guiding his son's hands toward the cracked cylinder wall they had set aside for demonstration. "See how thin it is here?" Daniel said, tracing the stress line gently. "That's where it failed." Noah leaned closer, studying it with focused curiosity. "So we make it stronger?" he asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "We rebuild it the right way." They worked in companionable silence, fitting reinforced components into place, tightening bolts carefully, adjusting tolerances without rushing. The act of repair felt quieter than the courtroom, but more meaningful. Metal meeting metal, torque applied steadily, structure restored through patience rather than spectacle. Outside, a delivery truck passed on the highway, headlights sweeping briefly across the shop window before fading into the night. Inside, father and son rebuilt what had once been flawed, not because cameras were watching, not because headlines demanded it, but because that was what they did. And in the steady rhythm of wrench turns and measured alignment, the collapse of a corporation felt distant compared to the simple integrity of making something last.
Hale Motors announced restructuring on a gray Tuesday morning. The statement released through corporate channels with carefully measured language about strategic realignment and leadership transition. Victoria Hale stepped down that same afternoon, her resignation framed as necessary to restore stakeholder confidence. Financial analysts dissected the move in studio panels, tracing stock recovery projections while footage of shuttered dealerships scrolled beneath ticker lines. In Mercer Auto Repair, the radio carried the update in the background, while Daniel adjusted the timing belt on a customer's pickup truck. The shop looked exactly as it had a month earlier. Same worn concrete floor, same pegboard of tools, same gray filing cabinet standing silent against the wall. No new signage appeared. No press crews lingered outside. Customers arrived with everyday problems: oil leaks, brake pads, worn bearings, and Daniel addressed each one with the same measured focus he had given a decade of documentation. Noah swept the floor near the lift, glancing occasionally at the radio when the announcer mentioned settlement funds allocated for affected vehicle owners.
Daniel reached for a clean rag and wiped his hands, grease dark against cotton before fading. The collapse that had shaken markets felt distant here, translated into practical repairs and restored engines rather than headlines. A customer thanked him quietly before driving away, unaware of the role this small garage had played in reshaping a corporation's narrative. The radio volume lowered as evening settled, and Daniel turned the sign to closed once more. Outside, the highway traffic flowed steady under fading light. Inside, the rebuilt engine hummed smoothly, no strain in its rhythm. Daniel listened for a moment, satisfied not with vindication, but with alignment. Some engines fail loudly. Others fail quietly for years before anyone listens. Fade.